Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Brickyard. I am Janice Jolie, and I am the curator for Asian Heritage Month 2023. And I'm so pleased to welcome our guest today, Bänoo Zan. Hi, Bänoo.
Hello, thank you so much for the invitation.
Yes, I'm so excited we have you because I really love how you weave languages into your work and how your work is kind of inextricably political because of the cultural context that you're coming from. So, uh, can you explain a little bit to our viewers just about your work? What are you writing about a lot these days?
Um, many poets, probably I have written about many subjects. However, what probably distinguishes me from other fellow poets is that I write a lot about politics, about culture, and about religion, and about how these elements, as well as, of course, when we talk about culture, it includes other elements such as nationality, and upbringing. All of these elements go into making us the humans that we are. So these days, I'm writing a lot about the ongoing Iranian protest, Women Like Freedom, that started in 2022, September, with the murder of Mahsa Amini in custody of the so-called morality police in Iran.
Right.
And so I think that's the main subject that I'm basically thinking about and writing about.
Hmm. And, this issue of women's rights, which is obviously ongoing worldwide, and then very specifically to what's happening in Iran and the suppression of women's voices. This is all kind of culturally relevant to you as a writer. So my question to you is like, have you always been like that? Have you always been interested in writing about the times, like from your earliest writings?
Um, Probably the earliest writing when I started to write, you write, you see the influence of what you read in your writing.
Right.
So I started writing in Iran at the age of 10. And at that point, obviously, I wrote in Persian, and I read a lot of poetry, Persian poetry, especially a lot of classics. I had quite like lots of hundreds of lines by heart, not sitting down specifically trying to memorize, but I had a good memory for poetry. And then all of this, but I think in the first couple of decades that I wrote, I was very much under the influence of what I read. But also, interestingly, in early teens, I would say I had feminist moments,
Yeah.
thinking about the way women are defined and limited within the religious context and cultural context. So I think that also sort of influenced me. But as I went along, read more and thought more, read especially more books about feminism, and thought about the culture and around me, and um, um, analyzed it. Um, I became more and more interested in literature that speaks to important issues of our times, which,
Hmm.
of course, some of these issues are have been relevant for millennia.
For
Women's
sure.
issues have been relevant for as long as we can probably remember.
Hmm. And so, being like a multilingual poet, for most of the people watching this video will be English speakers and English language writers. Who would be some of the great Persian poets that you grew up reading?
Oh, too many. Well, from classics, you could say a lot of these classics, of course, have been translated, like the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings by Ferdowsi, which is um, actually a fundamental work because it not only um, resurrected Persian mythology before Islam, but also helped preserve the language, Persian, as opposed to being dominated by the Arabic after the Muslim takeover of our part of the world. So, and then we have classics like Hafiz from 14th century, Rumi, we have Nizami, we have Araqi, we have Vahshi Bafqi. From more contemporary work, the four major 20th century poets, Ahmad Shamlu, Furugh Farrokhzad, Mehdi Akhavan Salis, and Sohrab Sepehri.
We're going to get these spellings from you so we can let our viewers check them out. And, the translation obviously is not the same. It's not going to do the work justice. But, I mean, I have read some Rumi and some Hafiz in English translations, and they're so beautiful. And I think one of the things I lament the most about not having other languages is not being able to access the poetry in its original form. When you read translations of Persian poetry, how do you feel about it?
Well, it depends on what translations I'm reading. Like some translators of actually Middle Eastern poetry do not even know, like Persian poetry do not even know Persian. Like Coleman Barks knows no Persian. Right. And so his translations are anything that have anything in them but Rumi. It's not Rumi we are reading.
Right.
And Hafiz has been translated in some more recent translations. Again, some of them are so far from Hafiz. Some people quote lines like, this is the famous line from Hafiz. It's not Hafiz.
Okay.
I actually prefer, I have to say, the earliest translations done by, of all people, the Orientalists, people like, I'm blanking out on the name, what do I say? Wilberforce Clark for Hafiz, and that when you read that, the whole divan, he translated it, the translation with all the explanations and notes. There's extensive notes and explanations offering cultural references, explaining allusions and everything else, comes to about more than 1,000 pages.
Okay, wow, so very detailed.
Yes.
So, I mean, I'm asking about translation because when you perform your works, you do kind of a live translation, right? You read the work, I think, in Persian, and then you say the line in English. And is that written on the page as such in Persian and then in English?
Yes, especially when I perform translations, because the reason I translate some of the works is because I'm inspired by them. So I want to give them precedence. And so when I'm especially performing translations, if I have enough time, I do it. I move in and out of the original text into English. I usually begin with the original text because I want to say, this is the text that inspired me. This is the text that wanted me to translate it.
Ooh.
Basically came, and that is how a lot of translations happen for me. Like when I'm thinking about a poem for a couple of days and I cannot forget it. It's a sign that poem wants me to translate it.
Oh, it's like calling to you.
Exactly. And so I go back and I translate it. I do my best. A lot of poems are very complex, as you know. The poetry is not only about content, right? It's also about the form, the form that is concise, the form that, has a music to it. So doing justice to all aspects of poetry is a lot of times an impossible task. And I try to just preserve a kind of balance between form as well as content, and do justice to, a lot of poems that I translate are classics, which means that, like when you read Rumi, this has been written centuries ago. but it's fresh. It's so fresh.
It's
You
still
can't believe
relevant,
it.
right?
It is
Yeah,
relevant.
it's
It's
so
fresh. It
cool.
shakes you. And when you read through me, you want the language to be translated as a language that is still fresh
Right. Okay. Make it
and grabs
contemporary in a
you.
sense.
Yeah.
It speaks
Yeah.
to the power of poetry being like about the human condition, and the human condition remains the same
Exactly.
after centuries. Bänoo, can
Yes.
we take a close reading at a work of yours? Have you chosen a piece that we can kind of analyze and go into?
Actually, I think I'd rather not. The reason for that being the fact that, there are two roles, in my role as an academic, as someone who analyzes work. I would like to analyze other people's work, and my work being, coming from two
Okay.
different, yeah,
Can I
yeah,
ask
yeah.
another way then?
Yes.
What are like some of the favorite poetic devices that you love to use in your work that you kind of come back to again and again? I mean, I think the obvious one for many poets is metaphor,
Mm-hmm.
but are there specific kind of word plays, there verse repetitions or form that you favor?
Yeah, yes, but I think the prominent figure that I use in my work is oxymoron,
Mm,
antithesis. And it's because I have my roots, like as a poet, I have been deeply influenced by um, poetry in Persian and poetry in English. I studied English literature and I taught English literature. So I'm a person, I would say, a borderline person that tries to reconcile the so-called two different opposites in culture, two literary traditions, and
mhm.
also two identities, in the sense that I am as Iranian as you may imagine, but at the same time, I'm also as much a citizen of the world, which means that sometimes those so-called traditional values are at odds with what nowadays we consider values. And so all of these contradictions are pulling me apart. And in my role as even a community organizer and as a poet, I try to reconcile these opposites.
Right. So
Yeah,
you're finding that is reflecting in your work. And so for our listeners, an oxymoron being like an apparent contradiction, maybe even just like two words next to each other that seem like they're opposites, but are kind of are illuminating the other through their polarity, right?
exactly.
So cool. You mentioned the work you do as a poetry producer. Could you tell us about like how you got into that and why you started creating space for poetry?
Um, I when as a person who deeply loves literature, my window to any culture is through its literature. So when I
Nice.
landed in Canada, in Toronto, I just Googled poetry events, and I went to one and to the next, to the next, to the next. And so in the first 2.5 years, basically, 2 years almost, yeah, I probably attended hundreds of events, during the day I would do job search and I would find nothing. So in the evenings I would go to a poetry event.
Okay.
And because I was alone, poetry became really urgent. That was the most important way I could communicate with my fellow human beings. I would go and I would listen to them deeply. I went everywhere, and I would also share if there was an open mic. Um, And everywhere I went, I was a person in the minority. I would go to events like white majority events, people like my age or some groups 20 years older than me, maybe even 30 years older than me. I went to other groups like Black majority events where I was the only non-Black in the room. I went to South Asian events. Again, I was the only person different. I
Right.
went to like Jewish events, the only non-Jewish person in the room, and so on and so forth. I went to poetry slam events where like the average age um, of the attendees was 20 years younger than me.
Sure. Yeah.
And I discovered so many wonderful and memorable voices everywhere I went.
Right.
And when I started talking to other people, I realized something, that nobody outside those circles knows anything about anyone else.
Ooh,
People who
okay.
have lived in Toronto all their lives, they don't know, for example, if you are a so-called literary poet or a page poet,
Mm-hmm.
they don't know anything about spoken word scene, and the spoken word scene doesn't know anything about the literary scene.
That's so
And I
common,
felt
right?
that,
This like
yeah,
silos that we have as these tiny little delineations between artistic discipline, and suddenly we don't know each other.
exactly. And I felt that, you know, these are all very significant and important voices that need to be heard. Why is it? So I
Mm-hmm.
thought I would start an event and introduce people who have lived in Toronto all their lives to one another. And the rest is history.
Really? So you really just intended to kind of connect all the different groups?
Yes, I think we are because what I felt, you know, as a person who was new and, you know, a stranger everywhere I went, I felt we are all poets. We all care about, like, poets are the nicest people you can ever meet. I'm not saying
Mm.
that because I'm a poet. Really, even among writers, poets are really compassionate, you
Mm.
know, they connect with people. So I felt, what a pity we are divided. Yeah,
Wow, it speaks to your generosity of spirit that like, and I think that's actually probably an extension of your practice as a poet who writes, but that you're interested in like connecting all these different communities that are kind of often exploring similar ideas about the human
exactly.
condition or about our times.
Exactly. Yeah.
Amazing. And these days, I, so these days, where are you finding your inspiration um, in like the local world where you live? Because you're currently in Alberta, being writer in
Yes.
residence. And are
Yeah.
you writing
Again,
these days?
yes, of course. And again, you know, one of the first things I did, I found local poetry events and I went and I connected with the community. And it's a very warm and vibrant community, very so-called healthy and active poetry community going around. And I'm so happy that I met the poets that I have met. And um, for me, inspiration comes from the real urge for connection. Like I read books, sometimes I read books that make me deeply uncomfortable,
Mhm.
but I keep reading them because I want to know how the writer argues the case. And also, I go and listen to people. You know, one of the other important sources of inspiration is poetry events. Somebody says something, you are reading a book, somehow the dots connect, and you know, the first line comes, and you know, and or you know, you go to workshops, you talk to your fellow poets, um, and these exchanges tell you, for me, because I want to write about things that are relevant, important things, and um, I think the role of a poet or a writer should be to tell the truth and to
Yeah.
um, from however I mean, however they see it, or the best they see it at that moment. Of course, nobody knows the whole truth, but in these attempts, being, you know, a non-North American, it's a very difficult task. Sometimes, you know, I find that I struggle explaining my point of view, but I don't give up. So I try to find the best way to explain my point to people who, all of us, I know, you know, poets and poetry community, we all care about justice. Most of us
Mhm.
care about justice, human rights, inclusion, diversity, kindness, right? We all believe in these values. However, the way we see them crystallized in the world are not always the same. And my view, coming from totalitarian theocracy,
Right.
sometimes is different. And sometimes I have important critiques against the way my fellow North Americans um, actually shape literary communities. And I think I try to make
Mm.
myself known or understood to the best of my ability.
Right.
Yeah.
I love what you're speaking about, Banu, about what I hear you talking about is listening, listening from to other people's perspectives, especially those who have different ideas than you, and listening to understand. And I know you just come out of, I think, the Edmonton Poetry Festival, Was there like exchanges of ideas there? Are those kind of gatherings of writers places where you really get to kind of go in as a poet?
I actually performed at one of their Edmonton Edmonton Poetry Festival events, a monthly event hosted by Shima Robinson, a phenomenal community organizer. But I'm scheduled to do more at the end of the month.
Okay.
What I was held really warmly when I performed there. Like, it was unbelievable the way community reached out, people who had never met me before. And I think one of the things that I also, probably out of necessity, being an outsider, had to practice was courage and honesty.
Ooh, two of my favorite words.
Yeah, you know what? Because a lot of times I would go to events and I would look around the room and I would say, I have a poem that deals with, Islam and Iran, and people around me, I don't think they have experience or knowledge about these things, but I feel the urge that I want to share it.
Mm-hmm.
I would share it and I would get the best response. Some of those moments led to like friendships. I'm friends with those people,
right.
And I think, because, one of the things that I have been rewarded by courage and by honesty. Of course, there are always people who would misunderstand you and who have made up their mind that, they don't want to actually open up to you. And sometimes it's also both ways, you also are not ready to open up completely to the other person. But if we exercise this more often, we are far more rewarded. And the end result also is far more comfortable because, a person who becomes friends with me as a result of hearing me, then I don't even need to keep pretending to be a different person. I can be myself in their presence.
You just lead with your authentic self, and that's what they connected to.
Yes.
Yeah. When you're saying like, oh, I have this poem about, Iran and women's rights, or I'm not sure if it'll land with this crowd, and yet it does, because, it might be culturally specific to a specific country, and yet those issues again are universal, right? And it reminds me of how storytelling is the way to build bridges to other people, right? That's how we, like, literally when I ask you, how are you? You would tell me a story about what you have been going through lately. And that's how we just understand each other. And then the poem allows us to do it sometimes just more concisely and with maybe some specific word choices. But in the end, the poet in practice is about connecting. Is that how I feel like that's what you do?
Exactly. And I also think poetry is actually poetry is actually the oldest literary genre, right?
Yeah.
And you might think that, like storytelling should be easier, but the earliest examples we have of literature is poetry. And the reason being that, yes, it tells you a story, but it leaves enough blanks for you to fill them up with your story. And so in the end, what you end up, the text becomes your story.
So true.
Yeah.
And that you see the images in your mind, you go on your own journey, you bring your own meaning to it. Exactly. Love that. Well, Bänoo, I think that's a lovely place to end. And I'll encourage our viewers to check out Bänoo's video performance of her poems. And what is the best way for us to stay connected with you, Bänoo?
I'm on 4 different social medias, LinkedIn. If you are interested in checking out a list of my publications, I always keep it updated on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook and Twitter as well. And nowadays I have like a web page on the current writer in residence, University of Alberta. Again, I keep it updated with events and information as well. But you really need to try hard to miss me. I'm everywhere.
Sure, totally. And how long will you be in Edmonton?
Until the end of May.
Okay, great. So for people in the Edmonton area, go check out Bänoo.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was lovely to talk to you.
Yay. Okay, bye.